Good afternoon. I'm Carol Christ. I'm the Chancellor of the campus, and before I make a few welcoming remarks, I'm going to read the civility statement. Before our program begins, I'd like to draw your attention to some general rules of civility for today's events. We hope you'll honor them by allowing all audience members to fully engage with the program. Kindly allow our speakers and your fellow audience members to enjoy today's program without interruption. Please turn off all cellular phones. Please refrain from blocking anyone's view with banners or signs. Please do not shout or engage in any action that disrupts the event or that prevents the speakers from being heard. This event is being live streamed and will be archived on the Berkeley website, and I really hope that you will enjoy the program. This has been an extraordinary day. We've had, starting this morning, a quite extraordinary convening of about 50 people, sponsored by PEN, the writers' organization that's based in New York, about free speech. And I wanted to say just a little bit about some of the things that I've realized from this day. But before I do that, I'm just going to say a few words about the complexity of the problem of free speech. Values, we're at a very interesting political moment in which values that have been associated predominantly with liberal interests and causes are now claimed by the right. It's really shifting the political dynamics around this both right and value. And free speech, as we've seen in the events of the last month and a half, often conflict. Free speech often conflicts with other values that we hold as a community, values of tolerance, values of inclusivity, values of diversity. People, particularly people from groups that have historically experienced discrimination, often feel that calls for free speech authorize the powerful, and that power is not evenly distributed, nor is the charge of incitement evenly applied. This was a powerful insight from today's discussion. In thinking deeply about this issue over the past 2 months, I've become convinced that understanding free speech is not a set of principles that you put on a piece of paper, but rather a process of engagement. And I think this day in University House has been an example of that process of engagement. Some of the insights that were particularly powerful to me were the following. We're dealing with a 21st century disruption. This is from one of the journalists in attendance, with 20th century methods, and we need to use technology more powerfully to address the problem. People asked in a very searching way what culture around the issue of free speech we were trying to foster, to nurture, to create. And the point was made, again, very powerfully, that our business is to encourage certain rules of discourse rather than to be concerned with the content of that discourse. That this was Dean Wasserman from the School of Journalism who spoke so powerfully about that's what the university is. We need to work to create discourse across difference. It sounds like an easy formula, but it's actually very hard to achieve, and I thought we began to achieve it in today's conversation. We also talked a lot about the siloed nature of the university and how that makes things more challenging. We each live in our own bounded community in the university in which we have less exposure to difference of perspective and difference of opinion. And we talked a lot about resilience, how we achieve and foster resilience as a community. You know that I'm appointing a commission on free speech. I'm excited for the commission's work to begin. And this convening today that PEN and the campus hosted provided lots of both suggestions, policy suggestions for the commission to consider, but also lots of questions that it wanted the commission to engage. So now I'm going to turn the podium over to Abdi Sultani, who's going to be the moderator for our panel. Abdi is the executive director of the ACLU from Northern California.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Chancellor Christ for her leadership and for convening today and today's events. I want to also just say I'm a Berkeley resident, so when the issues of free speech play out here on your university campus, it also, I can hear it overhead as the helicopters fly in Berkeley. And I'm proud to live in Berkeley and also to be a part of this extended community, although not a student or alum of your campus. Today, my job is to be only the moderator, so I'm really excited about this wonderful group of speakers, and my job will be to ask questions and to elicit your views, but not to dive into the content, although with my questions, I will probably guide things one way or the other, but I look forward to being the moderator and appreciate everyone's time being here today. So I'm going to do the introductions in a little bit out of, well, actually, I'll start at the far end. And I'm going to first introduce Suzanne Nossel. Suzanne's the executive director of PEN America. And I have had the pleasure of reading this great report called "On Campus for All," which really delves deeply into a whole set of issues related to free speech on our campuses. That's very thorough and really well done. So I welcome Suzanne for being here. Next, I want to introduce Rigel Robinson. And Rigel is a student here at UC Berkeley. He's a senior. He told me he's planning to graduate in May, but he needs to meet with his counselor to make sure he can. He serves as an elected student leader as the external affairs vice president for the University of California, and serves both on local and state issues on behalf of the students here at Berkeley. So really excited that Rigel is here with us today. Next we have Dean Erwin Chemerinsky. Dean Chemerinsky is the dean of the law school here at Berkeley, as well as being a professor here in the law school. And he is one of the great scholars and an advocate in the law, both on First Amendment, but also equal protection and many other issues related to our Constitution. So really excited to have Dean Chemerinsky. And then immediately to my left is DeRay McKesson, and DeRay is one of the very powerful voices that has galvanized this country's attention on racial justice as a voice for Black Lives Matter movement, and also as a co-founder of Campaign Zero to end police violence. So that's quite a lineup, so we're really in for a treat. So I want to just jump right into it. Maybe I could start with a question to Suzanne that will follow to everyone. And Suzanne, this is going to be tough for you to answer, but if you could pick one, what would you say is one of the biggest challenges facing free speech on our campuses today?
I would say it is this question of power imbalance and the ways that that plays out. We have in our Constitution and in our law, a whole set of really venerable, neutral principles that govern when you can speak, who can speak out, that constrain the ability of our government to impair free expression and your free speech rights. And all that I think is very important. It's an American point of pride. It's the strongest set of protections for free speech anywhere in the world, better than in Canada or in Europe. And yet those principles are being challenged by a whole series of imbalances in our society, and people are looking to those principles to protect the vulnerable, to enable voices to participate and come into our discourse when they've traditionally been excluded. And at times the principles don't work all that well in making those power realities allow everybody to really speak and participate in a full way. And so as PEN America, we look at our role as kind of guardians of open discourse writ large. So it's not just about whether the government is standing in the way of your speech. It's also about what voices aren't being heard, or what voices are being treated differently in the discourse. Are the rules being applied in a neutral way? And I think all of it has been complicated significantly by the rise of social media and the very powerful new platforms that we have to express ourselves, to connect with others, to mobilize, advocate, persuade, but also in ways that can be explosive, out of control. This potential for fake news to spread, long before the truth, even gets its boots on, to paraphrase Mark Twain. So I think in that context, these wonderful principles that we subscribe to as an organization and that we treasure as a society are being tested, and we face questions about whether to adapt them, how to apply them, how to defend them in the context of these new challenges.
So that's a great opening, and you're talking about these neutral principles in a society with a great deal of inequality. And I had actually very little of a job to do, and I already messed one step up, which was that I'm to introduce David Kemp, and today we're going to hear from the panelists, but there's also an audience polling that David's going to tell you all about. We're going to come back to the conversation in a moment.
Thank you so much, Abdi. So everybody should have a little device. So part of what we're trying to do is to encourage people participating. So we're going to do that here. So we're going to do that and hear from all of us with these little devices. Everybody should have one. And I'm going to ask you a few questions. They'll be mostly about who you are so we can know who came to this meeting, but then we're going to ask some questions about how you feel about free speech to give the panel some stimulus. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question. Just press a number according to your voice, to your choice. Do not press go or channel, and we can move forward, all right? First one is warm up to make sure it's working here and you understand how it works. Do you have any siblings? If your answer is no, happily only but not at all lonely, press 1. If your answer is no, but you often wish you did, press 2. If your answer is yes, but mom loved you best, press 3. If your answer is yes, and they were great most of the time, press 4. If your answer is yes, but I wished more than once that I didn't, press 5. And if the answer is complicated, then press 6. Okay, a whole bunch of us liked our siblings, a few of us had some mixed feelings about it. Okay, so we see the idea, right? Question, vote, answer. We're going to ask a few questions. The music for the question may or may not be related to the theme of the question. Which of these best describes your role at UCB? Student, staff, faculty, other member of the UCB community. Go ahead. All right. Students came tonight, 44%, but the staff people here too. All right. Let's keep going. How many times have you been around the sun? Have you forgotten your 5th grade astronomy? That's how old you are, because a year is one trip around the sun. Are you 25 or fewer? Press 1. 26 to 35, press 2. 36 to 55, press 3. 56 or better, press 4. I'm gonna go ahead. All right, so we got a good mix. So what to remember is our definitions of free speech and those trade-offs might vary by how old we are. So that's important for us to recognize. Which of these best describes how you think about your gender? 1, woman, 2, man, 3, transgender, 4, genderqueer. Go ahead. Okay. All right. You see, we're a little more women than men. Recognize it's all a social construct. We know all of that stuff. Do you identify as a person of color? Yes or no? He's dancing. Very nice. I saw that. Good mix here. That's about the mix in the United States, actually. That's funny how that is. All right, and your orientation. This is the last demographic question. 1, asexual, 2, heterosexual, 3, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, 4, questioning. So while the panel is talking, I'm going to go analyze whether our questions about free speech vary by which group, and then if we have some findings, we'll come back to y'all. Okay, so we see how it mixed there. All right, here are the next two questions, the real meat of this. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot this question. This is important to know too. Where do we stand on the political system? Hard left 1, left 2, left leaning 3, right leaning 4, right, hard right, or right on some issues, left on some issues. So we're skewed to the left. So it's important to recognize who we are. If we're trying to have a conversation that is broad and inclusive, let's remember who we are, and we're trying to make sure we invite everybody into that conversation. Okay, your level of hopefulness that our lovely school can navigate all these challenges. Very hopeful, hopeful, a little hopeful 3, not hopeful, doubtful, very doubtful.
I get a good feeling, yeah. Oh, sometimes
How hopeful are we?
feeling, yeah.
What about pit of despair?
So the good news is, so look at that. About 25% of us are on the not hopeful side. A whole bunch of us are hopeful though, so I'm glad, we're glad to see that. This is the last and perhaps most important question. You get to choose 3 from these. Which of these are most important to making the campus free speech atmosphere what you think it should be? We'll take our time on this question, but the polling should be open now.
Is there a way to move this toolbar thing right here?
Probably. Let's see. I think there was a glitch here. Okay. Well, just as you would expect, the technology on the most important question breaks down. I have to go fix that. We may be back to y'all later. But we're going to get to the panel that's so important. We got some great speakers here. Thank y'all for that. And we will go look at whether or not who we are varied our hopefulness. And I might be back up later with some reports on that. Thank you, Robbie.
Great, thank you. So, Suzanne, you kicked us off by talking about these neutral principles and the challenges that they're facing given this wider context of inequalities. And so, Rigel, you're a student right here at UC Berkeley. From your perspective, what do you see as some of the tough issues facing free speech at your campus?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, and I think depending on the channels that you get your information from, you could have very different answers to that question. To a lot of people in this country, if you read Trump's tweets and pay attention to a lot of the mainstream narrative around this issue, it would be easy to imagine that students obstructing the speeches of visitors who intend to bring agitators to campus would be infringement on free speech. But what I think is really much more terrifying is the response to a lot of these developments, particularly on legislative fronts. We've seen bills introduced in both the California legislature and the Wisconsin legislature that would authorize universities and the legal system to take fiercer action against students that obstruct speeches. And protest, organizing, freedom of assembly is as much an important facet of the First Amendment as every other clause in that long sentence. And the fact that these bills are gaining traction, making ground, should be alarming to any scholar of constitutional law. I think the Wisconsin bill actually made it out of their state assembly. I don't know where it is now, but that's a majority of a legislative body in this country deciding that it is okay to take action like that against students exercising their First Amendment rights.
So it's basically punishing protest. So you're seeing a threat to the right to protest as a concern that's on your mind.
Right.
Right.
I'm optimistic that here we will evade those kind of knee-jerk reactions. The chancellor's put together a commission to talk about what kinds of ways that we can adjust policy to ensure safety and free expression for students in the future. But that's going to need to be a really inclusive and thoughtful process, because it would be very easy to respond in a way that would make it even more difficult for students to express their views in the future.
Earlier, as Dean Chemerinsky walked in, he said I can call him Erwin, so I'm going to do that. So Erwin, you've been a professor and a dean here at UC Berkeley, but you've also taught elsewhere. What would you see as a threat to free speech on campus today?
I think the central problem for this campus and for all college universities is how to balance the need to protect free speech with also the need to create an inclusive, safe learning environment for all students. This is a public university. The First Amendment applies. As a university, principles of academic freedom apply. Above all, that means that all ideas and views can be expressed, no matter how offensive. On the other hand, the campus has the duty to make sure that this is an inclusive learning environment where all students can thrive. If free speech had no effects, we wouldn't protect it as a fundamental right. Those effects can be tremendously positive, enormously informative, greatly uplifting. But we delude ourselves if we ignore the fact that free speech can also inflict great harms. Many, such as my colleague John Paul, who's here today, scholars like Richard Delgado, Charles Lawrence, Mari Matsuda, have talked about the effect of hateful speech, especially on traditionally excluded students. How is the campus going to protect free speech while also make sure those students feel protected and included, that hate speech doesn't cause them to feel further marginalized or excluded? At the same time, the campus has the legal, the ethical duty to protect the physical safety of students, staff, and faculty. We've seen on this campus the tension between protecting free speech and safeguarding safety. We've seen the campus incurred enormous costs already to do that, costs that wouldn't be sustainable in the long term. So I do think that the problem that every campus faces right now is how do you meet the constitutionally correct speech with the duty that exists to create an inclusive learning environment that's safe for all students?
Well said. So, Dore, you have a national outlook on this. I take it you're not from California, right?
Correct.
But you're seeing these issues play out throughout the United States. So from your vantage point, what do you see as key issues affecting free speech on campuses today?
I think in general, there are two ideas. One is that it's impossible for me to think about free speech without thinking about the enforcement aspect of it. That I get it in theory, I'm like, yes, it makes sense to me. But what we know to be true is that the enforcement is just so different. I think Charlottesville is a perfect example of, you saw white people with tiki torches like pushing the police. They had stockpiles of weapons in Charlottesville, and the police were just like pretty chill about it. Whereas we were in Ferguson, and if you look back on Ferguson, in August, September, and October of 2014, it was illegal to stand still. So if you ever saw us marching, it wasn't because we thought marching was like an incredible tactic. It was because it literally, if we stood still for more than 5 seconds, we were arrested. And I think about the enforcement as being so different. And then there's this question of who gets to decide what incitement looks like. So you think about some of the speakers that have come to this campus, people who've gone to so many places, like don't think that immigrants should like be people, or they don't think that black people are whole people, or Jews, you will not replace us. Those sentiments, like that's incitement to me. Like that is hate speech. And when you think about like Nazis organizing, that like had a direct outcome on lynching in the past. And it is not too far-fetched to think that those same actions could come back today. And I think that on college campuses, there's this idea that if the campus is left-leaning, then we need to create space for conservative speakers sort of at all costs. And it's like, I'm not convinced that Ann Coulter is actually furthering any intellectual debate on campus, or Milo for that matter. So we can't like let this need for space for conservative voices really just be carte blanche for like any voice to be. Like, I think that becomes like this easy space that suddenly gets created when we enter into these conversations.
You talked about the comparison to Ferguson, between Ferguson and Charlottesville, which gets right at this issue of enforcement, where in one case we have a militarized response, and in another case we have a complete inadequate law enforcement response. And I'm wondering, like, as you've seen the last several years unfold, have your views changed or sharpened as you've seen the comparison between these events? Or do you find that it kind of, did Charlottesville kind of amp it up for you and make things even more clear, or was it crystal clear from the beginning?
I think it made it clear for a lot of other people. You know, we knew, I remember in Baltimore during the protests, we did an action like in a white neighborhood, and I was there and the police literally were like, please go home. We're like, you just told them, please go home? Like, you like arrested all of us in 2 seconds, but you like begged them to please go home because you didn't want to arrest them. And like, I think we've seen that play out time and time again. If anything, I'm interested in the fact that we don't think about protests as free speech, that we put all these restrictions on protests. So shouting people down like seems pretty free. Like that is a form of speech that we engage in all the time because we think that it's right and that we need to do it for some speakers, or we shut down streets, those sort of things. But we've seen these time, place, and manner restrictions placed on protesters, like you have to stand in a corner and those sort of things. And like, I just don't know, that doesn't seem very free to me when we think about this conversation. So back to this question of like who has power and who doesn't, is that is always at play in these free speech conversations, especially with the issue of enforcement. That is, like, I don't know how you talk about this in practice without honing in on the enforcement issue.
So Suzanne, just picking up on that, one of the themes that really stood out to me in your report was this idea that, you know, let's say there's some speech that contains a message that's discriminatory or hateful. And then there will be a counter speech or a protest by students criticizing or even attacking that speech. And then there's speech criticizing the counter protest, and it kind of goes on from there. And a number of the people who are quoted say, well, that's all speech, that's all protected speech. So what's your outlook on that? Like, is it all just speech and we just need more dialogue, and that the speech, the protest, the counter-protest, it's all protected speech that should be celebrated?
Well, a couple things. I mean, first of all, I don't think all speech is created equal in many different respects. And I do think, you know, get to this question of, you know, what we call and describe in the report as sort of the heckler's veto. So if we're doing this panel here and there are folks in the audience who start shouting and screaming to the point where we can't have this conversation, our speech is effectively shut down. You know, whatever we were going to say, you know, we can't get out. Those who may be in the room wanting to hear that don't get a chance to hear it because somebody in the audience has decided they're going to override it. And, you know, that, I think under the First Amendment is not lawful, and I think it's certainly not preferable, even if the speech is offensive. I agree there's the right to protest forcefully and vociferously, but we don't approve of protest tactics that effectively shut down and silence that speech. I think, you know, once you allow that, you know, there's really free speech for no one. You know, you may be the one next time, you know, maybe that protester next time who's up on stage, and then, you know, those who oppose him, you know, how can you say they don't have every right from the audience to shout him down? I think that's sort of a race to the bottom that, you know, in the end ends up protecting nobody's speech. You know, that said, can you protest outside? Can you have signs? Can you stand up and turn your back? Can you know, make comments throughout the speech? Can you ask a very challenging, direct, you know, potent question that puts the person on the defensive? You know, yes, I think all those things are perfectly appropriate, and there are ways to make yourself heard, you know, as counter speech that can be very effective and quite piercing, that don't end up shutting down the original speech. So I don't think all speech is created equal. I also, you know, this notion, longstanding notion that kind of the answer to offensive speech is more speech. And I think, you know, that is a good principle, and very often it can work. And if somebody is saying something that is baseless, you know, doesn't make sense, is predicated on fiction rather than fact, pointing that out, drawing attention to facts, to evidence, being persuasive, you know, very often is the best answer, but it's not a perfect answer. I think there are certain market failures in this, you know, ideal marketplace for free speech. You know, for example, when online, you know, somebody's being, you know, there's some kind of false accusations that's made that may get repeated, you know, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 times, and simply, you know, being able to rebut from your little account where you may have 250 followers, you know, may not be adequate. I mean, you may just be absolutely drowned out. And so I don't think it's enough to say, the best answer or the only answer to offensive speech is more speech. I think there are other kinds of tactics. I think it's important for the university to play its role as, sometimes a first among equal as a speaker. You have channels of communication that aren't available to the campus as a whole. And so when the university or somebody else in a position of authority speaks out, that carries added weight. And I think that can be, one example of a potent way to counter offensive speech that doesn't just sort of leave it up to individuals of their own account.
So here at University of California, Berkeley, there's a legacy of free speech that's associated not just with the free speech movement, but with each decade, a legacy of free speech. And I'm wondering, for maybe turning to Rigel as a student who's here now, how does that legacy figure into it? How do you see being a student at UC Berkeley with that legacy affecting how this issue is playing out on your campus?
This weekend, actually, I got back last night pretty late from a convention I was at with a number of major figures in federal politics, and this issue came up several times. The attendees were mostly college students. People had a number of questions, and Berkeley and conversations around free speech kept on surfacing. A number of students at other campuses are fearful that similar situations will happen on their own campuses. And there's a talking point that keeps being reverted back to, I think largely because it's easy, where a point will be made, but always capping it off with a reminder that it's important that we allow discourse and not shout down the speech that we disagree with. Obviously, that's impossible to disagree with. That is the purpose of free speech, and it's a principle, it's a value, and it's a wonderful thing. But I think to frame the issues that we're talking about and the situations that we're talking about within those parameters, the idea that these situations have happened because students just can't bear to be in a room with an opinion that they disagree with is a little bit insulting. I think what's happening is it's a lot more complicated than that.
What makes you say it's insulting? Can you elaborate on that?
This is a university. It's an enormous public university, and intellectual discourse happens here every day, and that's a beautiful thing. We have conflicting viewpoints on every issue that you can imagine. That comes out in our discussion sections, that comes out in our lectures, that comes out in events that are hosted on campus by student organizations. It happens when Cal Berkeley Democrats and Berkeley College Republicans have an annual great debate against each other, and it's very well attended and it's fun to watch. And that happens every day. What's happening here is not students hearing an opinion that they don't agree with and deciding that they need to burn things down. But what is happening is a climate and an environment being deliberately created by agitators that creates an unsafe space for the campus community. When someone like Milo comes to campus intending to bring people who were attendees literally at the Charlottesville riots, whether they've flown in from elsewhere or they happen to work at Top Dog and they're in the area anyway, we create a space where a lot of students will literally not be safe going on campus. You look at me and that doesn't apply to me. I'm a straight dude who's in theory a person of color because I'm mixed Korean and American, but I can walk through Sproul when it's surrounded by members of the alt-right and no one will ask me a question. I can get to my class and that's fine. But if that's not the case for you, whether because of your gender expression or because of religious garb that you wear, that is not okay. We have a principle of community at this university that says we're committed to creating an inclusive environment for all of our students. And this scenario, I think, has been heartbreaking in that we have to realize and accept that those really are just principles. They're not binding, and as much as we would like to believe that that is our purpose, that is what we will do, ultimately we may come into a situation where we have to violate a principle of our community in order to do what is legally prudent. And that's difficult. I think free speech and our history of free speech is intensely powerful, but that is much less of a player in the events that have happened than a lot of folks would like to make it out to be.
So I just want to pick up a little bit on this theme where I'm hearing maybe that there are some ideas or some speakers who are so vile that it's separate than the space that you normally afford to the difficult discourse students have. But then I'm also hearing the idea that, actually the shutting down of a speaker is a line, Suzanne, that shouldn't be crossed. So I want to pose this question to you, Erwin, in terms of, is there a line that just goes too far? And the university is in a really difficult place with obligations under the First Amendment as well as obligations to the educational environment.
I think it's very important to separate a discussion of what the law currently is from a discussion of what the law should be. I'm going to answer your question focusing on the former. The campus can never stop a speaker because his views are offensive. A campus can never stop a speaker because his views are racist. There are certainly lines where speech becomes unprotected, and we could talk about them. If the speech rises to being incitement of illegal activity, if it's what the Supreme Court has called a true threat, if it's harassment. But ultimately, the question is, do we trust government officials, and that includes campus officials at public universities, to make the decision as to what speech should be allowed and what's beyond the pale? The First Amendment says, no, we're not going to trust government officials. And I often asked, well, if we trust government officials, what would that have meant in the early 1960s when Southern universities wanted to keep civil rights protests out? They regarded them as provocateurs. They regarded them as communist-inspired. What's meant in the late 1960s and early 1970s is campuses tried to keep anti-Vietnam War protesters. They saw them as provocateurs. They saw them as inspired by communists. Is there a difference when we grant the government power between the speech we like and the speech we don't like? And do we really want that to be the basis for empowering censorship or punishment of speech?
So this meaning of incitement really gets to the heart of it. And in the law, the incitement needs to be imminent, a direct threat. And DeRay, you talked about incitement as being the language that creates the conditions in which these threats occur. What's your outlook, DeRay? You've talked about the challenge of enforcement and how unequal enforcement is. How would you advise a university to deal with these clashing values as they unfold in real time?
Like, I think about pro-choice and pro-life as like a space where we can just like disagree about some fundamental things. But some of the people who will be invited to speak, like literally just don't believe in any modicum of like diversity at all. And like that is like I don't know what both sides of that looks like, right? I don't know what both sides of like you not believing that people of color should have equal rights. Like I don't know, that to me doesn't seem like an issue that we should even give credence to. Like there are both sides that are equally legitimate, and I get that like people should have space to show up and talk about their beliefs, but there is something about what is the line that becomes incitement, because what we've seen happen time and time again is that they leave lecture halls like this and then things happen on campuses that are hate crimes. Like there's a relationship between like the space created and then the actions that follow, and I don't know how we ignore that. Like that doesn't seem honest to me. So when I think about my advice to campus officials is, I'm all about having many sides of issues present. Again, I would say that like, I don't think Ann Coulter is the many sides person, right? I don't think Milo is the many sides person. I think there are other people who can probably talk about like why they're against DACA in a way that might make some sense to me, right? Or they can talk about like why they're pro-life in a way that I can, even if I disagree, I'm like, okay, I got it. Like that argument makes sense, but that is not who the people being invited today, like that's not who those people are. And I worry that the space that's open has sort of said like, well, everybody's like equally legitimate in their beliefs and thoughts, and that's just not true. And we've seen the repercussions of that be really painful for people of color.
So I just want to pick up on that theme, and Suzanne, and the kind of analysis and research you've done, which is really quite thorough, and I really appreciate your report. I mean, I read every page.
We're not paying him to praise the report. So,
there's probably a few thousand person hours that went into that, and then I get the benefit of reading in just a few person hours. But I want to pick up on this theme between the relationship between the space that's created and then the actions that take place. And one of the topics that you look at in your paper is the whole issue of sexual harassment and sexual assault on campus, where there's real conduct that's directly harmful. I just would love to hear from you about if you have any insights on this point between the space that's created and subsequent conduct.
Yeah, I think it's an important discussion to have about whether hate speech and a climate that is permissive for hateful speech fosters hateful action. And I think there's some evidence on both sides. I mean, people are quick to, the example that's always given is the Rwandan genocide. It's a potent example where you had hateful screeds being broadcast on the radio there, and that was in the run-up to the genocide. And that was classic, I think, incitement to violence, where people were being stoked and energized and urged and encouraged to look at other people as subhuman and to take action, murderous action on behalf of those beliefs. So clearly, there can be a relationship between speech and action, but I do think we have to be careful in talking about incitement. And it's something that is looked at differently in different legal contexts. In Europe, they have concepts like incitement to discrimination or incitement to prejudice. Here, we focus really in our law only on incitement to violence, imminent violence or illegality. So it's not about restricting someone from inciting another into a prejudicial attitude or a discriminatory attitude. And I think we could agree that hateful speech, racially offensive speech, sexist speech, can be wounding, harmful, damaging. But I do think you get into very difficult questions of where to draw lines. For example, in Europe, there's a big debate, a long-standing debate about why depictions of the Muslim prophet Muhammad are not illegal. And some people argue, those depictions constitute incitement, just a priori. It's an act of incitement. It should be made illegal. And then other people feel and believe, as I do, that taking that completely off limits and rendering it illegal, begins a road down a slippery slope where there's all kinds of offensive. You have your view on abortion versus choice, and you think that that's a legitimate subject to debate. I mean, there's a very potent example right now being debated in our country about this 17-year-old undocumented immigrant who wants an abortion and is being denied that abortion. I think some people would argue, really calling that a legitimate subject for debate, is a denial of women's rights, and that that perspective really should be off limits. It's tantamount to incitement against powerless women in a powerless position. And, you could agree or disagree, but I think that, we have these very protective laws and constitutional requirements vis-a-vis speech that have in general served us well. I think what we see now is we have an environment politically that's very permissive for hateful speech, where from the highest levels of our government, that kind of speech is being endorsed virtually, or it's certainly at the very least being countenanced and subtly encouraged. And I think that has, opened the way. And I understand why, you argue as you do that, we need to take more assertive measures legally. But I do think kind of in the sweep of things, if we can find ways to counter these speakers who are noxious, who don't really contribute to our debate in ways that don't shut them down, we will have a much better precedent that won't be applied against social justice advocates, women's rights advocates, advocates for racial justice who, might likewise be called by someone else called provocateurs or called illegitimate speakers who can justifiably be shut down.
It seems like there's a difference between the quality of the discourse, and Dure, I heard you and Rigel both talked about that there are topics and spaces where legitimate perspectives can be put forward and people can grapple with them, but then we get into the question of what's the quality of that discourse. So I want to kind of twist this a little into a little different direction. And with Milo and Ann Coulter, I am no fan. I'm with you on that, Dure. And it pains me the amount of attention that they get by virtue of the way the story unfolds. And I'm wondering, is there a way to step out of that, whether it's advice to the activists or to the universities to not fuel their fire? Because were it not for, I'm not sure what they would have if it weren't for the protests and the counter-protests generating the attention that they get. So I'm just wondering if there's a way out of this that doesn't confront the First Amendment in a way that's a dead end, or shut people down in a way that fuels their the kind of attention that they're craving. Is there a way out, Rigel?
I think I hear time and time again with every one of these, people like to imagine, what if an event happened and nobody showed up? How funny would that be? Like, it'd be hilarious. There's no way to control for that. And frankly, I find it very difficult even to advise people really to do that. If something like this is happening and the way that if you feel affected by that situation, if you're going to manifest your reaction to this event in protest, you are absolutely entitled to do so. And it's difficult to discourage people from exercising their right to freedom of assembly like that. But there's a number of ways that we can respond to these sorts of things and mitigate the safety implications of them in ways that should be jurisprudence with the First Amendment. It's actually, I think, looking back to what happened with the Ann Coulter event last spring is an interesting model there. I think Steve Sutton's in here somewhere. Hi, I'm so sorry that Milo made fun of your mustache in his video. That was uncalled for. I appreciate your work. In the lead up to the Coulter event, Stephen, along with other administrators, had tried to work around the time, space, manner considerations of the event that was going to happen, make sure that were the event to happen, were we to accommodate it happening, it would happen in such a location and time of day that could minimize the harm likely to occur, A, to students, B, to the surrounding community. I mean, this has become a city of Berkeley issue beyond just a University of California Berkeley issue, and also to surrounding properties, et cetera. And it's interesting to me that we didn't seem as eager to do that as Free Speech Week approached. I'm only really disappointed in that because we actually, within the student government here, received a pretty explicit commitment to do so last year. The chief of staff for our former chancellor, this man named Nils Gilman, he'd swung by the Senate of our student government to touch base after the Milo event, take questions. We had many. He stuck around for a little while. But something that came up, we asked him, in light of everything that's just happened, what kind of best practices have you learned? What would you advise for administrations dealing with these sorts of events moving forward? And he gave us pretty explicitly two recommendations. That A, if Milo or a similar situation were to return, the event would have to happen during the day, and that B, it would not happen at the most student-dense center of campus, and that other venues could be found, which would still be the university facilitating the event happening, but taking necessary steps to try to mitigate the event. It's interesting to me that in light of that, maybe it's because we lose the media battle every way, no matter what we do. If Coulter's event gets reshuffled, she'll take to Twitter and accuse us of silencing her, even though she has one of the biggest platforms of any human being on this planet. But it's tricky. But I mean, there are ways to go around facilitating these sorts of things that are less destructive.
Right. So you're saying basically take that time, place, and manner principle seriously and apply it in a way that creates that safety and that condition for everybody on the campus. Let's keep going around on this theme and hear from each of you. What's something that you would want your university, whether it's the administration or the student community, to consider as something we could do or something people can do? Erwin,
I think it's exactly what Chancellor Christ and the campus did this fall. Let the speakers come, ensure their safety. The event will come off, hopefully, without incident, and that will then be the best way of showing that this is a campus committed to free speech and everyone will be protected. So just to break that down, I think it's very important that the campus allow these controversial speakers to come. I think when you're talking about people like Milo Yiannopoulos and Ann Coulter, what they most want was to be kept from speaking, because then they'd be able to portray themselves as victims, as martyrs. At the same time, the campus needs to protect the safety of everyone who's here. This is where I agree with you in terms of time, place, and manner restrictions. There is a right to speak on campus, but that doesn't mean at any time or at any place or in any form. The campus can make sure that the speech occurs, say, in an auditorium, where it can restrict access, where it can have metal detectors, where it can control the perimeter. It can also make sure that the speech occurs in a way that doesn't disrupt classes or other activities. I think at the same time it's important that the campus protect the ability of students to engage in counter speech. Ideally, it would be physically separated, but I think students have the ability to express their disagreement with, their detesting of certain messages, and that can be through leafleting, through counter demonstrations, teach-ins, and the like. If all of this happens, then the First Amendment has worked the way it's supposed to, and the campus works supposed to, and it's not going to get all that much media publicity, which then denies to people like Ann Coulter and Milo Yiannopoulos most what they want, the spotlight.
Let's go to you. What's your take, Suzanne, on a key step or a key piece of advice you would give to a university?
You know, I guess I would stress this kind of dual role of the university as a facilitator of all kinds of speech, but at the same time, as a moral voice that has a responsibility to make the campus truly inclusive and as equal as possible for all kinds of students. And I think that's one thing that really has been sort of encouraging, seeing this campus and other campuses inhabit that dual role where they say, fine, I'm going to let the Milo or the Ann Coulter speech go forward for the reasons that Erwin cites, which is like, honestly, it's the lesser of two evils to let them speak, have their say, deprive them of the chance to grandstand on the basis that they were denied a platform. And then, I think gradually the air will go out of those balloons. But at the same time, the university's coming forward very forcefully as an institution that's committed to diversity, that's and inclusion, that's mindful of those groups of students that are kept out of the discourse, that may lack the tools to participate, that maybe feel most threatened as those forces come onto campus, and what needs to be done from a security and safety standpoint, what needs to be done in terms of dialogue to amplify and elevate those voices. So I think that dual set of roles, and I'm not saying it's easy to balance them, but kind of looking at both as very serious responsibilities and thinking about how to really bring both to life.
I love this point because while the university can protect the First Amendment on a content-neutral basis, the university and its leadership have their own voice and should exercise that voice.
Yeah, I think one troubling thing, about these legislative proposals that you touched on is I think some of them really are risk impairing that by enforcing new or proposing new requirements that the university avoid expressing views on controversial issues. And I do worry that those could be applied in a way that sort of pulls the rug out from under this important role that the university has, I think, as a speaker in these instances, as well as a forum.
So, Dore, what's your key point, key advice to the university, both either as an institution or as a community of students and people?
My advice is to the protesters. It's always that you can change the tactics, right? Like I think about some of the most effective protests that we had in St. Louis was two people organized a protest of churches, and we stood out in front of churches and hummed Wade in the Water. And it was more powerful than anything that we could have done outside of those churches because they didn't know what to do with us like humming outside. It was like having the police come and like arrest hummers is sort of weird, right? Like they just didn't know what to do. Another thing that we did was, it was one of the earliest chants was they think it's a joke, they think it's a game. Like that was people don't really, that's not a chant that's big anymore, but it was in the early days it was. So we shut down this intersection by playing games. Like it was like Foursquare and hopscotch and Monkey in the Middle, and like we knew that the police they weren't gonna arrest like a 50-year-old white woman playing Monkey in the Middle, right? They just like weren't gonna do it. So they like came up ready to arrest us, and then they were just like, I'm gonna fall back. And it was an incredible way to like play with the tactic of protest. And I think it'd be interesting when some of these people show up to like have everybody just like talk in an inside voice as if the person wasn't there. That's like fascinating to me. Or like everybody like pass cards around, like something that like is obviously disruptive, but is disruptive in a way that people don't expect. And I think that can like shift the energy. And I think about when we did it, like I remember when we did They Think It's a Game, like the police came ready, right? And we just kept playing, and like you could just see them fall because they didn't know what to do. And like those sort of things are incredible.
I think could make for its own whole class. and it's a whole body of work and practice. and how do you exercise your First Amendment rights in a manner that has creativity, spirit, and brings life to your movement. Go ahead, Rigel.
In that vein, I don't remember which one of the evenings, but a number of students organized a study-in the hours preceding one of these events. A woman named Victoria pulled a number of students together to do exactly that. I mean, a sit-in, but with an emphasis on the optics of them being students there with their textbooks, and really reinforcing the fact that it's students, lecturers, faculty, staff here that were being affected by what was happening, who were here to maintain a school and learn, and that is being obstructed by everything going on. It's really a beautiful thing.
And I think in the context of the earlier question about University of California, Berkeley, let's just acknowledge that this is a perfect foil for these stories to unfold, given the history of this university, its stature. And so I love this theme of the choice of tactics, because that can affect what the story is that's told. So what we're going to do now is turn to our friend David Kemp to hear any themes from the audience polling.
Sure. Thank you so much. So there was just only a few notable subgroups that were different than the average. On average, 77% of us were hopeful on the three of the hopeful choices about what Berkeley could do, and 23% not hopeful. There was not a little bit of folks of color were a little bit less hopeful. But the biggest thing I noticed on that, Chancellor Christ, is that your staff have to lead us, because your staff is a whole bunch more hopeful than the students and the faculty, right? So about whether we can do what we want to do. So God bless the staff. Okay, gather clickers, we have 2 questions, and I'm going to let the panel come back and then maybe ask some questions and move forward. So, your level of agreement. It's important that UCB assess whether some socially toxic ideas are hate speech, and if so, prevent them from having access to the public square. From strongly agree, somewhat disagree, disagree, or strongly disagree. Okay. So what's interesting, Professor, you said earlier that you did a poll of your class, and it was very different than this. So the people who come to free speech events clearly don't agree with that, as a general matter, but some of us do. Some of us do, and then we need to make sure that we respect that opinion and hear from that. Last question, y'all. An important educational mission of UCB is to expose students and others to ideas that might make them uncomfortable. Strongly agree, same scale, somewhat agree, somewhat disagree, or strongly disagree. Let's see where we are. Okay, all right. Well, thank y'all again. So I'll take it back.
Okay, great.
Thank y'all so much.
So we've covered quite a bit of ground, and in a couple of minutes we're going to turn to some audience question and answer. I think that Erwin, you talked about what the law is and what the law should be. And I want to just say none of us on our own can be the decider of what the law should be. There's a Supreme Court. They have some authority. There's Congress, legislatures. But I want to put you on the spot a little bit and ask you, if I may, what do you think the law should be? Do you think that the standards are too permissive for language that's too close to the line on incitement? Or is there something to be inferred from other areas of the law about what the law should be?
Let me focus on the example of hate speech. The law is clear that hate speech is speech that's protected by the First Amendment. I think that's probably right, but I'm not sure. I can tell you why I think that's probably right. I've seen that there's really no way to define what's hate speech without being unduly vague and overbroad. In the early 1990s, over 350 colleges and universities adopted so-called hate speech codes. Every one to be challenged in a court was declared unconstitutional, almost always on grounds that it was unduly vague and overbroad. The University of Michigan, most famous of these, it defined hate speech as speech that stigmatizes or demeans on account of race, sex, religion, sexual orientation. What does it mean to be speech that stigmatizes or demeans? Most European nations have hate speech laws. They're phrased in similar language. Last year and the year before, when I co-taught a class at the University of California, Irvine on free speech on campus, we asked our students to try to draft a hate speech code that wouldn't be unduly vague and overbroad. The students couldn't figure a way to do that. Also, I have great pause as I look at the experience under these hate speech codes and hate speech laws. So often they're used against the very groups they're meant to protect. When the University of Michigan had its hate speech code, every enforcement action under it was brought against African American and Latino students. When England adopted its initial law prohibiting hate speech, the first prosecution under it was brought as a Zionist group, with the prosecutor saying Zionism was a form of racism under United Nations regulation. Just to pick an example, because you mentioned pro-life versus abortion rights, I worry that we may not be far from a time when the United States Supreme Court is going to overrule Roe versus Wade and allow states to prohibit abortion. I fear then that those same states will prohibit advocacy of abortion rights by saying that's advocating murder in a form of genocide. Do we really want to empower the government to prohibit speech in that way? But maybe most of all, I still believe that all ideas and views can be expressed, and hateful ideas and views are that. They're ideas. And I'm so afraid of giving the government the power to pick and choose and say, these are the ones that are beyond the pale. And yet, I'm still persuaded by all of the discussion about the harms of hate speech, which is why I think the law is the way it should be, but I'm not sure.
So I had to ask the question not just of what the law is, but what it should be. And I'm sensing you're grappling with some difficulties. And I also heard you earlier acknowledge that, we should acknowledge that speech can be harmful. And I want to just maybe give a quick moment for a rapid fire from our three other panelists on any theme, any quick point that's on your mind before we turn to Q&A.
I'll just add one thing about hate speech, which is last week the New York Times had a little quiz to see whether you could discern what Facebook considers to be hate speech, because hate, that's a whole other set of questions. And Facebook as a private company can ban hate speech. They're not subject to the First Amendment, and they can impose community standards. And I think we can all understand the rationale for it. We don't want to go and see a lot of hateful speech in our Facebook feed. And so I thought, well, I know something about hate speech. I'll take this little quiz, and I probably do pretty well. I failed the quiz because, there's just one example that I remember, which was, was some speech about, a poor black woman. Poor black women are, I don't remember exactly what it was, but they're lazy and they belong at the back of the bus or something like that. And I thought, okay, hate speech. It wasn't hate speech apparently because of the modifier poor. And hate speech only applies to protected groups. And so because the word poor was added there, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm sure someone will look this up and find that I haven't gotten it exactly right. So with that caveat, because of the addition of the word poor, this was kind of then not hate speech. And so I think it's a good illustration to add to Erwin's of just how tricky it ends up being in practice to define these things in a way that is sufficiently precise to really be a workable standard.
So it's the difficulty of defining it. Rigel, a quick thought on your part right now.
Yeah, I think it would be reckless of me to speculate what the law should be next to Dean Chemerinsky. But I will say the idea, of us going to courts over any of this is terrifying. I think it's easy to imagine that there is literally nothing that Milo wants more than for Yiannopoulos v. University of California to be precedent-setting law that could disrupt everything that we hold dear for the rest of time. But outside of kind of those legal, judicial parameters. There's a lot that we can be doing to address the roots of what's been going on. There's a lot we could do to address why students wanted to make these events happen in the first place. A lot of people look at this and think it's like a right versus left battle happening within Berkeley, but it's really like a 7 students versus another 40,000 people who generally agree it is annoying that this is happening battle. And conversations around the climate that exists that made them want to do that are important. I think it's also worth noting that these efforts were being initiated by a very small squad of men, and there are conversations around toxic masculinity and entitlement that should be had about the motivations for putting on an event like this that will come at the detriment of the entire city. Moving forward, if we really want to champion ourselves a campus of inclusivity and tolerance, I think it's important that we put our money where our mouths are. There are a lot of other very pressing needs on this campus, and a lot of the students who have felt most marginalized by the events of the last several months have demands, and they're organizing around them. The recruitment and retention centers want a better space to conduct their operations in. We have a number of students, undocumented students, who are likely to find or have already realized that they are no longer eligible for work permits, or that their family members back home are no longer eligible for work permits, which makes it very difficult to continue to be a student here. So I hope that soon we can realign our attention away from discussions like this, as important as they are, to really
deal with the conditions of inequality and the conditions of access and opportunity that affect students on a daily basis. Great. So Dare, what's a quick closing perspective from you?
I'm interested in how the internet is starting to radicalize young people and people in general. So you think about their Instagram accounts with 200,000 followers that are just hate accounts and they're private. And with Instagram and Facebook, the way the reporting works is that it requires you to report, like you have to report it for it to get shut down. But how do you report a private account? You don't. So it's those sort of things that I think are going to be the next frontier of these issues. I think that the obvious hate speech, Twitter will figure out. I think Facebook will figure out. But it's like, what about the secret Facebook groups that were made for the right purposes? It was like, what if you're in a country where organizing is legally prohibited and the Facebook group is the only way, the private Facebook group is the only way that you can get together? What happens when that actually becomes neo-Nazis now? And then we're like, well, what? Like, nobody's reporting that because all the people in it are people who believe in those things. So like, that'll be, I think, the next frontier. And I'm sensitive to the hate online. The first person ever publicly banned or permanently banned from Twitter was somebody who tweeted that he was raising money to take me out. So I think about these issues all the time. And I think that sort of stuff will be more obvious as time goes on. It's like the private accounts are going to be the thing that I think will be interesting.
I think what your point there suggests actually is these are vast arenas for scholarship and study, and the university itself, with both the talent of the students and the faculty, could actually dedicate itself to grappling with these questions and figuring them out, not just in a US context, but internationally. I think you're hitting some really difficult and important topics there. So what we're going to do now is we've heard from an amazing group up here, but we want to turn the conversation not through just the online poll, but through actual questions. So where is the microphone? Great. So we have a wonderful person who will be walking around with the microphone, and she is going to hold on to the microphone like dear life. So she's not releasing the microphone. So if anybody wants to make a comment or to ask a question, please do so. And I'm going to be just informally watching time, so I ask these comments or questions to not exceed a minute each.
I'm very curious about the time, place, and manner application. Let's say we had a progressive speaker like the Senator Sanders, who comes to campus and would draw thousands of students to listen to him. And we offered him Sproul Plaza, but at 5 p.m. But if we had a provocative speaker, like Milo or Ann Coulter, and we offered them Edwards Track, which we could control, and at 5 p.m., would that be a violation of free speech?
Let's keep...
Someone gives an actual legal answer to that. The scenario that you're describing, almost happened. About 2 years ago, an organization that I work with successfully had the Sanders campaign agree to do a campaign rally on Sproul Steps. That is a rally that ended up being held at Frank Ogawa Plaza in Oakland. We communicated with Dean Greenwell, found out that the security costs and implications would not be feasible, so we did not host the event, and then proceeded to not claim that we were being silenced or that our free speech was being oppressed by the university, but just for context, I appreciate you bringing it up there.
Do you want me to answer?
Please.
Sure. The context will matter enormously. Why is the university drawing this distinction? If the university is drawing the distinction solely based on the viewpoint, liking Sanders' viewpoint, not liking Yiannopoulos' viewpoint, then that violates the First Amendment. But if the campus can say the difference is based on articulable, demonstrated safety differences, then it's a completely different situation. So imagine, as to Sanders, there's no reason to believe that there's any threat of violence. But imagine, as to the latter speaker, on the basis of what's occurred previously when that speaker's been on campus, or when the speaker's been on other campuses, or what the campus knows through its information, they really believe there is a safety threat. And the campus can show that the difference is not about viewpoint, and viewpoint isn't the pretext here, but there's really a safety difference, then the campus can constitutionally treat them differently.
And picking up on these two things just as an observation, and I love your example of the student Democrats and the student Republicans hosting these debates. It's just no one else hears that, because that's not going to be broadcast on evening news. So I think documenting these examples and communicating them in the context of these controversies will actually be quite helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with the empathy tent. So it's this tent we set up at these different conflict situations like the Milo event and Ben Shapiro. And we offer listening and empathic mediation between the different sides. And we've had mediations between the different leaders. So we see the situation a bit like a dysfunctional couple or dysfunctional family, that they're all speaking, they're all screaming and yelling at each other, they're demeaning each other, they're putting each other down. And if we have more free speech, we just get more of that. So what seems to be missing, I would say, is really free empathy. So what would you say is, how do we actually go about creating more free empathy in this situation? Because we're looking at a relationship, right? There's the speakers and the listeners, and it's how do we kind of build up a positive empathic relationship?
Suzanne?
I mean, that's a lot of our focus as Penn, a sense that this different sides in these battles very often are sort of talking past each other, caricaturing one another, demonizing one another, and that if you can actually get them in a room, and I think we saw this today, in fact, there's some valid perspectives that conservative students today brought up that I think some people hadn't heard. I think people were all enlightened by hearing Erwin Chemerinsky talk about the First Amendment foundations of this. Carol Chris spoke about how hearing DeRay's account of the power imbalances and how that plays in, informed her thinking. So I'm with you. I do think, though, there are some people who don't come to these debates in peace. There are people who have no interest in empathy or fostering understanding or even really persuading people of a different view. They're about building their brands, building notoriety, provoking, creating a media spectacle. And so I think you have to, you can't assume everybody is coming to these controversies with goodwill. I think, the vast majority are, but for those who aren't, I think you need to kind of meet them with the agenda that they have.
Let's see if there's another question. Okay. Yeah, she's not letting go of the microphone.
Oh, great. I'm not going to take it. Hi, I'm an MBA student. So something that we struggle with a lot is that we end up with a lot of people who have similar viewpoints consistently in the conversation. And something that we found today when we did the poll early on is that a lot of us were hard left or left. So that's great that we're all in the room, but we all have similar viewpoints. And so something that I'm wondering is how you think we can get a lot more people in the room. Like, something that I wonder is, how we can incorporate these kinds of conversations into our class discussions, for example, how we can talk to faculty about this, because I know that we all take classes, so that's one example, but I even find that this is something that our professors aren't bringing up. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I think it's like, I think it might be this false notion that like viewpoints have to be equally distributed. I think that what is important is that you've considered the other side and that you've like thoughtfully engaged it. But I don't know if every room has to be like half and half for it to be a room where there's like equity of voice or where there's like diversity of thought. That like I've thought deeply about some of the like rights. You know, I was in this one meeting that was like half Republican. It was like a work group. And I asked them like, why do you disagree with welfare, right? And I had all these ideas of like what they were gonna say. And she was like, and I'll never forget it, she was like, DeRay, I think that welfare takes away people's dignity. And I was like, I think that being homeless is like, actually takes away your dignity, right? Or like not having food takes away your dignity. And her whole thing was that like giving people things for free, like takes away their dignity as people. And like, we fundamentally disagree about that. But it was important for me to like hear that perspective. And it's like, I've grappled with it, I've thought about it, and we just like come out on the other side. But it's not that I like didn't put myself in proximity to those other thoughts to be able to engage it. So I don't want us to, I worry about building this narrative that like, there are always two sides and that we got to give equal voice to both sides. And I think that this administration is a great example of like some things you're just like lying, right? Or like some things aren't true or some things aren't right. And we shouldn't have to be in a space where like everything has to be 50-50 for there to be like equity of voice.
So we've only heard from that side of the room. We haven't heard from this side of the room.
Hi, so I've heard the theme of the Republicans and Democrats on college campuses kind of getting together to show that there is some, not like unity, but we like, so I'm the president of the Democratic Club on campus, so it was especially kind of interesting to hear that come up. And, you know, for instance, Regil, who's actually my roommate, we were both in Nevada this weekend, and when I got home last night from, you know, this 10-hour drive, my first reaction wasn't to make food, it was to call the president of a Republican club and set up a debate. That will never make it in the New York Times. That'll never make it anywhere. It's just gonna be when Berkeley when Berkeley takes safety precautions. I guess my question is, since this kind of seems to be a theme of just highlight the good rather than the bad, what would anybody up there recommend that looks like?
Say your last sentence again. I'm sorry.
Sorry. So I've noticed the advice that we should be highlighting the good to kind of wash out the bad. And this isn't necessarily a legal question, but my question is, what would that look like and yeah.
Got it. So how to highlight the good. I mean, the thing with news media is it loves controversy, and things that lack controversy are often not newsworthy. So I'm looking to you, Suzanne. Have you seen success in this area?
Yeah, I mean, right now people do have the perception it's so polarized here that they're, you know, it's always sort of, you know, the joke that the news media likes to write about man bites dog, not dog bites man. And so it's the unexpected. So, you know, if you're collaborating with your counterpart in the college Republicans, you know, maybe you write a joint op-ed and you say, you know, everybody thinks we don't even speak to each other, and you know, we're on opposite lines of the, you know, sides of the picket line, but in fact, you know, we're planning this event together, and you know, here are some things we can agree on. And I think you could get that piece published right now because there's a lot of interest in Berkeley, and you know, people might be surprised to learn that you could come together around a common message. So I think, you know, if you ask for, you know, that's maybe one small example, but I think in a climate of polarization, to actually be able to demonstrate some collaboration, you might be able to get some attention for that.
So,
and I would just
want to point out, though, that Suzanne's answer was actually right next to her, the freedom to write. So, go ahead, DeRay.
I'd say, too, like, we don't actually often see in the public space any sort of debates. Like, that's just not something that you see often. So I could see, like, a dope 2-minute video on Twitter or something, of, like, literally of the debate, of the content of the debates is, like, actually an interesting sort of thing if it's high quality debating, right? That like, that would be a story in and of itself that people I think would be engaged in, because you just don't, I can't think of the last time that I actually saw like people our age like debating issues in a way that was like organized and thoughtful and wasn't like, we don't see that often, so that could be interesting.
So in that answer, there seems to be one thought, which is how to actually exercise your voice in whatever arena is available to you. And then I loved, Ray, your point about the choice of tactics earlier, that when these controversies are unfolding, that itself is a stage where you can demonstrate that. And so that might be another opportunity. So we have time for one final question. Every question came from just this side of the room. Okay, there we go.
So one thing that I'm curious about is intention in terms of freedom of speech. I think Suzanne said something about if your intention is getting as much publicity as possible, or if your intention is really just marketing, does that still constitute freedom of speech? Should I be able to stand here, let's say right now, and just talk about nothing, or just say any kind of words, or tell you about a business I have? Do I have a right to do that, really?
I think that it's certainly protected by the Constitution that the purpose of your expression is to reach an audience, and the freedom of speech is followed by the freedom of press, which reaches an even larger audience. But I think on that question, Erwin, do you want to give it a shot as we close?
Well, you said is absolutely right. The First Amendment protects your right to speak. It doesn't depend on your underlying motivations. Let me give an example. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led protests in the South in the early 1960s, he wanted very much to provoke a police reaction against the demonstrators. He was disappointed when the police didn't react against the demonstrators, because if they did, it then made national news. In fact, they put children at the front of the march, so if the police came with billy clubs, it would be the police beating up children. Does that motivation of provoking a response mean that it's speech unprotected by the First Amendment? Of course not. The government isn't able to pick and choose speakers based on their underlying motivation. So long as it's speech that's constitutionally protected, the government can't censor it or punish it.
So we've had a very productive day of discussions earlier, and Chancellor Christ, you shared a few major themes from that, and I'm sure there's many other learnings for you and the members of the community who participated. And then we followed that with this panel with 4 incredibly thoughtful voices and leaders who have brought such important perspectives to the discussion. And I just want to close by sharing, if I may, just a couple of observations that really stood out to me. One was your point, Rigel, as a student of this university, that you don't want to have your university in a legal confrontation that gives a censored speaker what they wanted and sets up potentially even further bad law. That really stood out to me as a student in this community who's mindful of equality and justice, that that's not an outcome that you want. And then another point that really stood out to me was, Dere, your call for the tactics and what is the nature of the protest, what is the nature of the resistance and the response when these situations are playing out, and using the full array of tools that are available to us to express ourselves in the face of hate and discrimination. And that's another perspective that really, really stood out to me. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. It's one that will continue at the University of California at Berkeley. It will sometimes unfold not in moments when there's space for reflection. It'll sometimes unfold in the heat of the moment. But what's so important about what you're doing today is creating that space when there is the time to reflect that will inform the actions we take later in the heat of the moment. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to the University of California, Berkeley.